There is a serious problem for the West, for sure. I think the West did not see it coming. The biggest risk to peace and security in Africa is France. Let's make no mistake about that. So how can President Bazoum be proud of himself? What development is he talking about? You're talking about developing France? There is no development in Niger, one of the poorest countries on earth. And of course, IMF would love them. World Bank would love them. France would love him because he is allowing the pilferage, the exploitation to continue. The performance that you're talking about is the performance of what Nigerian minerals are doing to French education, to French healthcare, to French infrastructure.
What an incredible woman, honestly. Dr. Arikana is one of those people that just leaves you motivated, inspired, and just smarter in general. So, I want to talk about the recent interview, I believe it was yesterday, that she gave to Al Jazeera. And it was an incredible interview because they let her talk. They were not stopping her every second or cutting her off. They were letting her finish for the most part. So I appreciated the interview for that reason. And also, there were so many gems that I want to discuss that she talked about and pointed out. First, I want to show you a snippet of the clip that I want to address. We'll come back and discuss.
Mali, Chad, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Gabon, Niger. The West looks at this like maybe there's a problem going on here. How do you look at it?
There is a serious problem for the West, for sure. I think the West did not see it coming. However, it was very naive of the Western nations to think that the exploitation of Africa was going to continue unabated forever. The West is definitely, if I may use a four-letter word, not so kind, they may be pissing in their pants because what's happening in Africa is indeed a revolution, and a revolution that's way past due.
So you see it as a revolution, but what kind of revolution is it in the sense that
The African heads of states, particularly those heads of states of the former French colonies, majority of them were just puppets put in place to continue the same French legacy, which basically boxed them in, where it said you have no control of your military, you have no control of your natural resources, you have no control of your finances, and if you continue from those three areas, you are free to rule your country any which way you want. What power does that president have? And in the past, any president that has tried to back the system and do something about taking control of the financial resources, and I'm talking about African countries depositing their bank reserves with France. I'm talking about African countries giving up their natural resources, no value addition, France having first right of refusal for all the natural resources discovered yet to be discovered, France companies having first right of refusal for all contracts, large, small, private, public, France having military presence in those countries, and France having the ability to invade them in the event that they feel their interests are being violated. France making sure that those countries can only be trained by France, the military can only be trained by France. The military equipment can only be bought from France. Come on now. Our people didn't understand all this. So we can change African heads of states in those former French colonies like we change clothes. If those fundamentals are not addressed, nothing is going to change. The Africans now understand where the real problem is. The real problem, like I've always said, the biggest risk to peace and security in Africa is France. Let's make no mistake about that. We have other former colonizers. Yes, they still have a stronghold in Africa through their multinational companies that continue to siphon billions out of Africa every year. We are aware of that. But the biggest problem when it comes to former French colonies is France. Its roots are so entrenched in those countries, and now France is trying to expand into other nations. Until we address those agreements African countries were forced to sign, nothing, and I mean nothing we do, is going to bring us the true economic liberation, which is what Africa needs, which is what Africa was denied when African countries were being given their independence. We are now dealing with an African electorate that understand what is really going on in Africa.
Well, let me ask you, Ambassador, let's take Niger for a moment. President Mohamed Bazoum is a popular president in the West. You know, the IMF liked him, the World Bank liked him, the United States liked him, France seemed to like him. I would like our listeners to understand the gap in the popularity of someone like President Bazoum and performance, and what is going on that makes that revolution, that coup as we see it in Niger, a different story than we're seeing?
The performance that you're talking about is the performance of what Nigerian minerals are doing to French education, to French healthcare, to French infrastructure. You tell me, why is it that 95% of Nigerian uranium is powering over 30% of France, while over 70% of Nigerians have no electricity? How is that okay? How is even President Bazoum proud of himself with that fact? There is no development in Niamey. I was in Niamey a few years ago when we had the AU summit. It was pitiful to see the level of underdevelopment that Niger has. There is no development in Niger. Let's make no mistake about it. Niger is the second poorest country in Africa, in the world, in fact. So how can President Bazoum be proud of himself? What development is he talking about? You're talking about developing France? There is no development in Niger, one of the poorest countries on earth. And of course, IMF would love them. World Bank would love them. France would love him because he is allowing the pilferage, the exploitation to continue. And that's why the people are rising up to say, if you can't stand up to the bullies and tell them that the exploitation can no longer continue, and look President Macron in the face and say, President Macron, how is it okay that my money, my bank reserves, my natural resources are funding French education, are funding French healthcare, are funding French infrastructure? How is that okay, President Macron? Answer us. Africans in Niger, they want to know. So when you tell me that he is favored by the West, it makes sense. But he's definitely not favored by the people because there is no development. Let's be serious here. Let's stop pushing lies about what's happening. They know the exploitation is happening. It's happening in Niger. It's happening in Burkina Faso. It's happening in Mali. It's happening in every African country. Let's make no mistake about this. We're sick and tired of giving up our lunch to Western nations. African children, they need to eat too. African children need to go to school. African children need good healthcare systems. Behind all that abuse, we need to let the Western world know that there are millions of African children who are going hungry, millions of African children who are dying, millions of women, African women who are dying, giving birth to another life, millions of African youth who are unemployed, all because the Western world is continuing with the agenda of exploitation, and exploitation of the African continent. That era is over. Well, and we're coming together as Africans and saying, enough is enough. This has got to stop.
From a practical viewpoint, and I just want to challenge you for a minute, I think a lot of people in France who might say, hey, we've got to do something, we have an obligation to do something, see their resources as necessary. How do you get it right? Because if you go to no resources coming into these countries, is that okay? Or what would you advise those in the international development field to begin using as their North Star in how to get this equation right so that Africa can grow on its own terms, but that it's not necessarily cut off from the rest of the world?
I think that's a very important question you're asking, Steve. We're not asking that the Western countries we should just cut them off. No. We're saying the parasitic relationship that these Western countries have with African countries has got to come to an end. We are simply saying we do not need aid, we need trade. They must come to Africa, treat us with respect, treat us as equals. You take, for example, Niger is selling its uranium to France for 80 cents a kilo, when the rest of the Western countries are buying the same uranium at $200, 200 euros per kilo. It is amazing. Over 99% of the value of their uranium is going to France and other Western nations. Value that should be coming to Niger. That is wrong. It is thievery of the highest order. We're simply saying, come to Africa and treat Africans fairly. Trade with the Africans fairly, just like you trade with other nations. And yes, sir, we need foreign direct investment. We need our Western allies, but our Western allies must understand Africans are humans too. Their needs are just as important as the needs of those citizens of the Western nations.
First of all, it's the laugh for me, honestly.
There is a serious problem for the West, for sure.
She's really enjoying this, isn't she? And yeah, she said, I'll use 4 words: pissing in their pants. I usually use personally shaking in their boots, but both of them work. So she talked about how she believes this is the revolution, and she also called it a revelation, whereas Africans are actually waking up. Like, we've been misinformed, misled, and told only the African heads of states are the problem. And now we're seeing things for what they are: the invisible hand. That's what she said. And that invisible hand made sure that Africans remain where they want Africa to be. And I couldn't have said it better. Like, that is one of the best things social media has done for us. And this era, like this generation, really realized what the invisible hand is. For so long, we've complained about our presidents, our leaders, which is true. Of course, they were messing up and they were being puppets and they're being used, but it stopped there. Like, we literally addressed them and we just moved on. We said they're corrupt, they're making our lives miserable. The unemployment issue, the resource issue, the non development in our countries, like, we blamed it on them and stopped there. When there's a gigantic invisible hand running things behind the scenes, and if we never addressed that invisible hand, we would have never been able to get this revelation or this awakening. So I'm so grateful that we have awoken. The other thing that she talked about were about our puppet leaders, and she said that they were put in place to continue France's legacy, which is true, because she mostly in the first, I would say, half of the interview, she was addressing France and everything that goes on with France, former colonies, and all that stuff. In the end, because he was asking her questions like, what do you think about Russia, China, and even the US, she addressed a few things then. But mostly she was talking about France. She said, the real problem, and I quote, biggest risk to peace and stability in Africa is France, end quote. So, according to at least Dr. Arikana, France is the biggest and the number one issue for African countries. And if we're talking about just this Western African countries, the ones that were colonized, the ones that are now saying no to France and rejecting France and don't want to associate with France anymore, and they don't want to be exploited anymore, most of them are former colonies of France. So I understand why she's focused on France at the moment. And another answer that she gave that made me smile ear to ear was when the interviewer asked her about President Mohamed Bazoum that was just overthrown by coup in Niger. He asked her, like, But him, a lot of Western countries say that he's really good, he's developed, he's done quite a lot, and the IMF, World Bank, they really like him. And she's like, Bazoum developed France, not Niger, and that's why they loved him. And I was like, yes, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Like, whenever they say that they love a leader, there's always something behind it. There's always something that that leader is doing for them. Or at the very least, they are trying to win him over or get them on their side. So they're trying to butter him up, right? So she said that about Bazoum, and she explained how she feels like Niger is underdeveloped, and Bazoum literally didn't develop Niger, was her point. Yeah, in a nutshell, this interview was really great in my opinion, because as I said, they let her speak and they didn't cut her off a lot and they didn't try to put words in her mouth. And also, I really highly recommend you go and watch the full video. I'm only going to put up a snippet here, but you go and check out her interview on Al Jazeera. But another thing I don't want to forget, she talked about Niger selling uranium to France at 80 cents per kilo, but other countries buy uranium $200 per kilo from France, and that 99% profit goes to France, and Niger gets that 1%. And that's the kind of exploitation that we are dealing with. But all in all, awesome interview. I loved her energy, and you can just tell how much she cares, and how much this triggers her. And this is the kind of people that we need. As you know, she's the former ambassador of the African Union to the US, and she knows a thing or two. And I remember even when she was an ambassador and she was talking about these things, people were speculating they are going to do something to her. And a few months later, she was no longer the ambassador. Like, so at the end of the day, we need more people like Dr. Arikana. Thank you for caring about us and our people. Hope to see you in a leadership role soon. We love you. And fam, let me know down below what your thoughts are about this interview, and also what stood out for you from what Dr. Arikana said.